Hey, this is Michael Lindsay, and we're going to go over the 2020 KTM motocross range with the SXF models. This is the four-stroke motocross bike, so we're going to cover the 250, 350, and 450 models, go over what's changed on them, what they look like, etc. But also, KTM has sent over the media packet that's embargoed, that's just getting released now, for not only the four-stroke motocross models, but our SX lineup, which is our two-stroke motocross bikes, our XC lineup, or XCF, which is the four-stroke cross-country lineup, which we have here in North America, and then the actual XC model line, which is the two-stroke lineup. That's got some new stuff with TPI bikes being brought in that spec, which is pretty new considering the bikes we've gone over here the last couple years have either been labeled XCW, EXC, basically an enduro model. So stepping up to the XC, we're getting more of an aggressive off-road race model in the TPI technology. So that's a big one. If you want to look at those, hit the links in the description below. I'm going to cover the other model ranges in separate videos. And like I said, in this one, we're just going to focus on the four-stroke model lineups. So we're going to start with the 250 SXF. Before we get too much farther, though, let's real quick recap actually what the 2020s are. This will be the second of 3 years inside the latest generation of KTM motocross bikes. KTM, as of recently, actually past decade or so, has been doing bikes in 3-year model spans for a generation, and really a generation is capped off by engine architecture, frame architecture, and bodywork design. So we saw coming into the 2019 bikes, we had an all-new bodywork across all these bikes, fuel tank, subframes, seat, etc., updated frames. Not a huge engine architecture overhaul because they had done some really big engine updates. Basically, they built almost all new engines just about 3 years prior at the beginning of that prior generation. So definitely not the biggest overhaul they've had in years, but still enough to really cap off what they're considering a next generation bike for them. So 2019 was the beginning of that. 2020 is now our middle ground of it, and then 2021 will be the exit of this generation motorcycle. So going into the second year of this generation, you're typically going to expect just some minor overhauls, or not minor overhauls, minor tweaks, refinements. Nothing really is going to stand out that big. So going into the 250 SXF, there really isn't anything major that stands out. It shares the same updates as all three you're going to hear me talk about do. It's got new graphics, it has new fork settings, and new shock settings. WP now calls all their motocross suspension ZACT, XACT. It isn't new components. It's still the same AER 48 air fork up front and the same traditional shock design they've been using for quite a few years now in the rear. The big changes are the overall settings themselves for each bike on what they were looking to improve. The shocks have a new compression adjuster. They've changed either some of the parts or the design of it to improve performance or tuning, as it says in the PR. Typically, to me, that means they've made the compression adjuster maybe a little more sensitive to clicker adjustments, so it makes a bigger change when you actually click it. For the forks, though, it comes off of the 2019 factory edition that I tested. Some of the settings they've changed with that bike are carrying across all three of what we're about to talk about is a lot of how they've changed the initial stack in the fork, the initial shim, the way it flexes. They're trying to get a little more initial feel of these bikes. When they went from the 18 to 19 to this new 19 generation frame, they beefed up the head stay area a lot in the frame, and to me it lost a little bit of comfort from the prior bike. It has more per se feedback or maybe maximum grip level, but not as much comfort. There isn't as much flex or give, and it makes the fork feel a little more dead and harsher in your hands and a little more top down initially. So with these changes, they're really trying to get the fork to settle easier, try to get a bit more feel and comfort initially out of the fork. So that carries across all three bikes. That's what the 250 has. Like I said, its own setting updates. Nothing is particularly listed for the engine. I was told there would be some minor updates here, and if I had to guess, ECU mapping is going to be one of them, because something that's kind of hidden, I wouldn't say hidden, but it's not as obvious until you really look carefully at the PR for all three of these bikes, is an optional airbox perforated cover, or perforated airbox cover. And what that means is, if you've seen the race teams, they like to drill holes in their airbox cover, particularly for the KTM and the Husqvarna. And the reason for that is their airbox design is a little bit restrictive. The engine, of course, is acting like a vacuum, and as it spools up, as the RPMs rise, it's pulling in more air and it becomes a stronger vacuum. Well, at low RPMs, when you first blip the throttle open, it takes whatever static air is inside the airbox at the time and pulls into the engine. Then it needs to replenish that air and continue to pull it in. The airbox is pretty tightly sealed on these bikes, so it struggles a little more at low RPM. All their engines do, particularly to maybe come off the bottom aggressively, because it takes them a minute to get the air replenished and pulled through the tight gaps of this airbox. And then once the engine really starts to get up and spinning, it becomes a stronger vacuum that allows it to pull in the air easier. So it tends to really start to rip in the mid to top end range for all their engines, for their motocross models. So the perforated cover is just a way of them to be able to get the air in easier initially, which would tell me that they're probably going to have the map 1 and 2 on this bike. One might be designed more around that cover. Like I said, KTM isn't always the biggest about identifying all the little tiniest changes in these initial PRs, so I'm sure when we go to test the bike here, probably in, I would say, by mid to late June, they'll probably tell us a little more. I would suspect some ECU updates to go along with that perforated cover. That's an option with the bike, that it basically comes with in your like toolkit you get with it. Maybe a couple other little tweaks. They changed the piston and cam last year, maybe a further change on that, but that's really all there is with the 250. Moving over to the 350, same graphic update, same suspension update, probably pretty similar to 250, because the 250 and 350 actually share the same frame. The 450 has its own frame because the cradle and a couple areas are different for that engine. But the 250 and 350 engine architecture are basically identical, so they're able to utilize the same chassis, especially because they have more of a similar feeling on engine inertia, so they affect the chassis a little more closely. The same. All three of these bikes share the exact same swing arm, though. KTM is really big about carrying over as many parts as they can. 350, same thing. Not really much listed changes. Once again, I was told there'd be a minor change. I'm sure once we go to the test, they'll mention something, whether it's a slight change to crank weight, a piston, something like that. It will come up. Nothing major listed. Once again, though, perforated airbox cover. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the 450, but where this has really come from. Something else to identify is tire choice. For all three of these bikes, they're still using Dunlop's MX3S, even though the MX33 tire is out. Had heard from a Dunlop rep that the MX3S for them, they've discontinued making it for, not discontinued, but discontinued the sale of it as they transferred to the 33 product, but some OEMs are still speccing the MX3S based on their testing right now, just where they were at in testing cycles. So it's still going to be an OEM spec tire per se for a little while longer. This might be the last year we see it on some bikes. Some OEMs will choose to move to the 33 this year. Some will continue to stick with the MX3S for the brands that choose to spec Dunlop, which of course is pretty plentiful on the motocross side. Moving over into the 450 SXF. Now this is where we see the most listed changes. I personally got invited to a kind of a private / media test back in early February that KTM conducted here in the USA. They wanted to hear from some of the main media test drivers that were involved in shootouts this year on what some of the concerns were with the 450 SXF. Particularly, a lot of us in media testing had a really similar feedback that we wanted to see more of a crisp response from the KTM. We felt maybe they were a little lethargic down off the bottom, and we just felt like they could be a little more connected feeling. So we went out with them, did ECU, airbox testing, a few things. Some guys came over from Austria, and the perforated airbox covers came up in that test. So it was kind of cool to see those make it to production. Those were more rough cut, but they did mention that they would maybe make a finalized spec of that. The 450 also says that in the listing that it will come with an optional airbox cover. Once again, I would say it doesn't show mapping change, but we did test a bunch of different maps on the 450 that day, and there were some that were well improved that I could see being on the U.S. market. Of course, all three models we're talking about here are U.S. spec. We do get in the United States, or North America per se, a different spec than Europe. A couple things that stand out. Our suspension settings are developed for this country in particular. The U.S. has their own R&D staff that tests constantly for that. The second one, at least for the 450 for a while, has been a different transmission. Last I checked, Europe had a 4-speed. We have a 5-speed. And then finally the mapping choice. I think we're getting aero mapping. Oh, and muffler. Europe has a little bit quieter muffler with a different an extra baffle or something. The US runs the 250 muffler, so it's a little bit less restricted. It's still really quiet, but definitely helps it rev up a little bit quicker, pull a little better to the mid to top end range. The Husqvarna is a world spec bike, technically at 450, so they have a universal muffler used in all countries, but with KTM, we have our own US muffler spec. So those are some of the changes that we see, particularly for our country's usage. The other updates listed are an updated piston and a change to gearing, which is all stuff we tested in the winter. They went to a 49 tooth. I believe they had a 48 on it before. We all just kind of commented that the gearing felt a lot really spread on that bike compared to pretty much any other 450 last year. I remember when I tested and Shootout was the bike, I would most commonly go to second gear for a corner just because the gearing was so spread out from gear to gear. Third felt like it was so lugged out. When I wanted snap and response, I had to go all the way to second, where on some bikes I would stay in third. And then unless we were on like Glen Helen, it almost felt like you could never get out of third gear. So they've tightened that up a little bit because they already had such a plentiful amount of power and they had such spread gearing. It made the bike easy to ride, but honestly, they could afford to take some of that back. So got the gearing change there, piston change, Perforated optional cover, same suspension updates as the Air 2 bikes, albeit of course its own settings specifically for the 450, but similar direction, some similar part changes there to try to get more initial feel. And like I said, nothing else is really listed. I expect the mapping change to also be there. They really didn't mention it last year either. They don't seem to mention ECU spec updates that often, but we had tested some in the winter that definitely were a big improvement for this bike, even coming off the factory edition that was released earlier in the year. There's a little bit more of a crisp feel, more connected, not arm jerking power, but just something that was a little more pliable in corners that seemed to respond to little throttle actions a little bit better. So really, that covers the updates for the 4-stroke motocross bikes. It's like I said, it's nothing drastic. It's model year 2 of 3. If you're interested in a KTM, it means it's a good year to get it. You're not on the outgoing model. Basically, you're not going to get this and then a year later or even 6 months later in the case of the 450 factory editions they're not going to drop a new model that's going to make you regret your choice. You're going to get a solid, you're going to get this bike solid year plus the following year before they go through and do the next generation jump for the bike. So you're getting some refinements off the 19 for each bike that's going to help without being in danger of basically getting the last year of a generation. So if you're interested, good time to get them. If you want to learn more, keep tuned to this channel. I'm going to KTM's launch, which I think, like I said, should be sometime in June. I would expect middle to late June. KTM's pretty good about getting us into these bikes in June. Being that it's not a big overhaul, it should be just a local intro here in Southern California. They'll probably split it up, a couple media outlets. 2 or 3 of us will go out of time, pick a track we want. We'll get to spend the day with them and get to ride them a bit, so it won't be some big global launch. But like I said, too, whatever we test there is US spec, so keep that in mind. And if you like info like this, the KTMs are not the most info, but some of the bikes will be dropping this year have some other really big changes. I love to break them down. So when we get that tech info, I'll go through and do these style first look videos for those, reviews for those. So hit subscribe if you want to learn more. Thanks for watching.